When Big Shaq walks into Elite Apex Fitness, he's met with smug looks and outright dismissal. The staff assumes he doesn't belong, but they have no idea who he really is. By the time they realize he's one of the gym's biggest investors, it's too late. Careers crumble, power shifts, and Shaq doesn't just get revenge, he changes the game forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq wasn't just another man walking into a gym. He was a force. At 6 feet 5 inches, built like a sculpted titan, and dressed in a black designer tracksuit with gold accents, he exuded a presence that couldn't be ignored. His limited edition sneakers barely made a sound against the polished marble floors of Elite Apex Fitness. Yet somehow, the entire room seemed to register his entrance all at once. This wasn't just any gym. Elite Apex Fitness was a fortress of exclusivity, a playground for the ultra-rich, the genetically gifted, and the socially elite. It catered to A-list celebrities, CEOs, and pro athletes, each one more obsessed with their status than their form. Everything in the building screamed power, wealth, and privilege, from the gold-plated dumbbells in the VIP section to the private recovery spas lined with Himalayan salt walls. Shaq didn't hesitate as he strode toward the front desk, his movements measured, confident, deliberate. He had been in places like this before. He knew the unspoken rules, the way money could open doors, but skin, stature, and silence could close them just as quickly. Behind the counter, the receptionist, Lauren, was busy scrolling through her tablet, tapping away without a second glance. She was young, blonde, and impeccably put together, the kind of person who had mastered the art of polished indifference. Shaq stopped in front of her, placing his black titanium membership card on the counter. A subtle power move, a reminder that he wasn't just a walk-in. Lauren finally glanced up, and for the briefest second, her practiced smile faltered. Her blue eyes flickered with something unspoken, something calculating. She took in his broad shoulders, dark skin, and imposing frame with the kind of look that wasn't outright hostile, just doubtful. The moment passed quickly, replaced by her customer service mask. She flashed a smile, perfect but hollow. "Welcome to Elite Apex Fitness. How can I help you?" Shaq didn't miss a thing. He saw the glance toward security, the slight hesitation before she reached for his card. It was subtle, almost instinctual, like she was preparing for a problem before one even existed. "I've got a membership," Shaq said smoothly, nodding toward the card. Lauren picked it up, flipping it between her fingers, stalling. "Apex Titanium membership," she murmured, eyebrows raising slightly. Most members didn't carry this level of access. It wasn't just VIP, it was ownership tier. And yet something in her demeanor shifted. A split-second flicker of hesitation, a barely there tightening of her lips. Shaq had seen that look before. It wasn't about the card. It was about him. He exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. This wasn't the first time he'd walked into a place and felt the unspoken weight of judgment. It wouldn't be the last. Lauren tapped at her screen, but her fingers moved too slow, like she was searching for an issue that wasn't there. Shaq waited. Behind him, the gym pulsed with activity. Well-groomed men in compression shirts and designer sweatpants exchanged stock tips between sets. A group of socialites in matching athleisure sipped on $20 green juices, side-eyeing Shaq like he was an exhibit at a museum. He caught the tail end of a whisper. "Does he even work out here?" Shaq rolled his shoulders, keeping his face unreadable. "Let them wonder." Lauren finally looked up, offering that same artificial smile. "I'm just checking something real quick, Mr. Shaq. One moment." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Checking what exactly?" Lauren's fingers moved faster now, searching, digging, almost as if she wanted to find a reason, any reason, to make him wait. In his peripheral vision, a man in a navy suit appeared. Here we go. The gym manager, Troy Davenport. Late 40s, sharp features, salt and pepper hair slicked back to perfection. The kind of man who never broke a sweat, even in a place built for it. He had the walk of someone who believed he owned every room he entered. "Is there a problem here?" Troy asked, his voice smooth, calculated. Lauren sat up straighter, suddenly finding a voice she hadn't used earlier. Mr. Shaq is trying to check in, but I just needed to verify his status in the system, she said, all innocence, tilting her screen toward Troy. Troy barely glanced at it before looking up at Shaq, his smile sharp, unreadable. I'm afraid we have a very selective membership policy, Troy said, his tone dripping with forced politeness. Not just anyone can use our facilities. Shaq tilted his head slightly. Not just anyone. A lesser man would have reacted. Raised his voice, demanded to see a higher up. Shaq? He simply smirked. It was a subtle thing, but it landed like a punch. Troy's smile faltered. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. Shaq held up a hand, stopping whatever excuse Troy was about to spit out. That's cute, he said, voice calm, smooth as steel. Troy blinked. Excuse me? Shaq took his card back, slipping it into his pocket. They wanted him gone. They wanted him to push back, to get angry, to make it easy. Instead, he took a step back. Casual. Unbothered. He glanced around the room, at the curious eyes watching him, the judgmental smirks, the barely hidden whispers. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he turned toward the exit. And just like that, the air in the gym shifted, because something about the way he left felt like a warning. Big Shaq set his black titanium membership card down on the counter with the ease of a man who knew his place in the world. Elite Apex Fitness was supposed to be a haven for the powerful, the wealthy, the elite. And he was all three. Lauren, the receptionist, picked up the card, but her fingers hovered over it like it might burn her. Her eyes flickered with something. Hesitation. Discomfort. Maybe even doubt. Shaq noticed. He noticed everything. She forced a tight plastic smile, the kind of expression people used when they were stalling for time. One moment, sir. Just need to check something. Shaq arched an eyebrow. Check what exactly? She turned toward her screen, tapping at the keyboard, but Shaq could tell she wasn't actually searching for anything. She was waiting for backup. And right on cue, Troy Davenport arrived. The gym manager strode toward the counter, his tailored navy suit crisp, his cologne expensive, his arrogance suffocating. He had the air of a man who had never had to prove himself to anyone. He took one glance at Shaq, at the card in Lauren's hands, and let out a slow, dramatic sigh. Shaq already knew what was coming. Troy picked up the card, turning it over as if it didn't belong to one of the highest-ranking members of the gym. Then, with a smug, rehearsed smile, he placed it back on the counter like it was a counterfeit bill. Sorry, sir, but this gym has strict membership requirements. His voice was smooth, practiced, full of polite condescension. I don't think you qualify. Silence. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He could feel eyes on him, the weight of the moment settling around him like a noose. From behind him, whispers started. Soft, careful, but loud enough for him to catch. Who let him in? He's not the type they usually accept. A soft laugh, almost melodic, came from the lounge area. Shaq glanced out of the corner of his eye. Victoria Lane, socialite, influencer, a woman who had built an empire off inherited wealth and expensive gym selfies. She sat on a plush leather bench, sipping a matcha latte, her manicured nails tapping against the cup. She didn't even try to hide her amusement. Shaq's fingers flexed at his sides. He turned his attention back to Troy, who was still standing there, waiting, expecting him to argue, to get defensive, to make a scene. Instead, Shaq smiled. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that made lesser men rethink their choices. I see, Shaq said smoothly. His voice was low, controlled. And which part of my membership doesn't qualify? Troy's smirk flickered, just for a second. A crack in the confidence. But then he squared his shoulders, regaining his footing. It's not about the card, Troy said. We just have a certain standard. There it was. The unspoken truth. Shaq let the silence stretch, forcing Troy to sit in it, letting everyone in that room feel the weight of what had just been said. Then, very slowly, Shaq reached across the counter, picked up his membership card, and slid it back into his pocket. A calculated, deliberate movement. "You're right," Shaq said. Troy's smirk returned, but Shaq wasn't finished. "This place does have standards," he said, stepping back, voice carrying just enough for the surrounding members to hear. "And now I know exactly how low they are." Troy's expression stiffened. A flicker of something else passed through the crowd. Unease. Doubt. Whispers shifting in tone. But before anything else could be said, Troy made his final move. He nodded at a nearby security guard. Shaq barely had time to register the shift before the guard. A man built more for intimidation than actual conflict stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the guard said. Not a request. A demand. A few gym members sat up straighter, eyes widening slightly. This was more than just an inconvenience now. This was a scene. Shaq let out a breath. Controlled, calculated. For the second time that day, he did what they least expected. He didn't fight. He turned, walked toward the exit. But the moment he stepped away, something shifted in the room. The gym members had expected a blow-up, a confrontation, a reason to call him a problem. But instead, he gave them nothing, and somehow that made them even more uncomfortable. Victoria watched him leave, her smirk slightly less confident now. Troy stood behind the desk, adjusting his already perfect tie, his hands gripping the counter a little too tight. Even the security guard hesitated for just a second. And then, as the doors swept closed behind him, Shaq pulled out his phone, dialed a number, put it to his ear. A pause. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said, "It's time." The weight of 100 eyes pressed against Big Shaq's back as he moved toward the exit. The room was silent, yet deafening. He could feel it, the whispers that slithered just beneath the surface, the barely hidden smirks of amusement, the quiet scoffs from those who thought they had just watched a man be put in his place. Shaq's footsteps were slow, deliberate, and unhurried. Each step against the polished marble floor echoed, cutting through the hushed tension of elite Apex fitness. The gym, which had moments ago been filled with the rhythmic clang of weights and the steady thump of treadmills, now felt frozen. The socialites in their $500 athleisure sets pretended to sip their overpriced green juices, their eyes darting toward him as they exchanged whispers behind manicured hands. A group of Wall Street executives, men with sharp suits and sharper tongues, nudged each other, smirking like they had just witnessed an inside joke. Shaq saw all of it, felt all of it, and yet he didn't react. That was what unsettled them the most. They had expected outrage, expected him to lash out, demand answers, prove himself. That would have made it easy. That would have justified the smug looks, the security guard's stiffened stance, the way Troy Davenport stood behind the front desk, adjusting his tie like he had just won something. But Shaq gave them nothing. He kept walking, shoulders squared, head high, jaw set in stone. That was when the doubt started creeping in. The trainer near the free weights paused mid-rep, frowning slightly as he watched the scene unfold. A receptionist at the check-in desk, not Lauren, a different one, nervously tucked her hair behind her ear, as if suddenly realizing she had just witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. And then there was Dylan, a young personal trainer, barely in his late 20s, standing near the stretching area, gripping a towel a little too tightly. His jaw clenched, his eyes locked onto Shaq's retreating form. He had seen this before. The same dismissal. The same quiet exile. The same unspoken rule that some people simply didn't belong. And yet, no one ever said it outright. Dylan had been working at Elite Apex Fitness for 4 years, long enough to know how things worked. The gym catered to the kind of people who believed exclusivity wasn't just about wealth. It was about bloodlines, networks, legacies. You either fit the image or you didn't. Dylan watched as Shaq reached the doors, still calm, still composed. There was something about his posture that sent a chill up the young trainer's spine. This wasn't over. Not even close. Shaq pushed the glass doors open, stepping out into the cool evening air. The shift from the controlled atmosphere of the gym to the open world outside felt like stepping through a veil. One world where power was dictated by perception, and another where power was dictated by reality. His custom black Range Rover was parked right at the curb, its sleek midnight finish glistening under the streetlights. He had barely taken 2 steps toward it when he stopped. A deep inhale. A slow exhale. He felt the frustration settle in his chest. Not because he had been turned away, but because he had expected it. Because it was so predictable. He let the moment sit. Let the irritation simmer just beneath the surface. Then, with the ease of a man completely in control, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice answered. Shaq didn't bother with greetings. His dark eyes flicked once more toward the gym doors, where a few curious onlookers still peeked out. Then, in a voice calm, deliberate, and carrying the weight of something inevitable, he said, "It's time." And just like that, the game changed. The atmosphere inside Elite Apex Fitness had returned to its usual rhythm. At least, that's what the staff told themselves. Troy Davenport leaned against the front desk, smirking as he recounted the Big Shaq incident to a small group of trainers and receptionists. He stretched his arms behind his head, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed he had just done his job well. "I swear," Troy chuckled, shaking his head. "Some people just don't understand what exclusive means. This place isn't for everyone, and honestly, that guy saved himself the embarrassment of trying to keep up in here." Lauren, the receptionist who had initially stalled Shaq, let out a forced giggle, twirling a pen between her fingers. A few nearby trainers, careful to stay in Troy's good graces, nodded along, offering weak smiles. The idea that they had just denied someone with real status hadn't even crossed their minds. Not yet. At the lounge area, Victoria Lane, the socialite who had smirked during Shaq's exit, sipped on her organic matcha latte, scrolling through her phone like the entire thing had been an afternoon comedy show. The people here had seen situations like this before. People who didn't fit the gym's image, being subtly turned away. It was just how things worked. Then, suddenly, the shift. The moment that would unravel everything. The glass doors burst open, and a man in his early 50s stormed inside, his face pale, his normally polished demeanor shaken to its core. David Sterling, senior gym director. A man who had never rushed anywhere in his life. But now, his expensive loafers slapped against the marble floors as he barreled toward Troy, his phone still clutched in his hand. Troy straightened, frowning at the uncharacteristic urgency. "David? What's—" Sterling didn't let him finish. He grabbed Troy by the arm and pulled him aside, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Tell me you didn't just turn away Big Shaq." Troy blinked. He scoffed, giving a lazy shrug. "Yeah, he didn't fit the—" Sterling's grip tightened. "You idiot." Troy's smirk faltered. "What?" Sterling yanked out his phone, his hand actually shaking as he scrolled. Then he shoved the screen into Troy's face. Troy's stomach dropped. Right there, under Elite Apex Fitness corporate database, was a name he suddenly wished he had never dismissed. Big Shaq Titanium Apex member, VIP ownership tier. And underneath that, private investor, equity holder, multiple luxury gym chains. Troy's breath caught in his throat. His skin went ice cold. Number. This had to be a mistake. A coincidence. But then, his world shattered completely. Sterling inhaled sharply, pressing his fingers to his temple. "The owner just called me. The owner. You know, the guy who signs your damn paycheck?" Troy couldn't move. "The guy you just kicked out?" Sterling continued, voice barely above a growl. "He owns part of this gym." Troy felt like he'd been hit by a train. The world around him blurred, twisted. The room, which had felt so in control moments ago, now felt suffocating. The sounds of the weights clanking, the steady thrum of treadmills, the low chatter of socialites, it all suddenly faded to static. Lauren gasped. He's an owner?" Victoria, lounging in the corner, sat up a little straighter, her face losing its amusement. She had been laughing at a man who could probably buy the entire building. Troy tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. Sterling ran a shaking hand through his hair. "The owner is on his way, right now. And unless you want to be unemployed in the next hour, you better figure out how to fix this." Troy's hands clenched at his sides. He was not the type of man who begged. He was the type who called the shots, who controlled the gate, But this time, he had locked the wrong door, and now he was about to watch it get kicked down. The murmurs in the gym grew louder. Members who had been laughing minutes ago now exchanged nervous glances. People who had dismissed Shaq were now questioning everything, because there was something worse than being an outsider at elite Apex Fitness, being on the wrong side of power. And right now, Big Shaq held all the cards. The heavy glass doors of elite Apex Fitness swung open with force, crashing against the walls like a thunderclap. The gym floor went silent. The rhythmic clanking of weights, the dull hum of treadmills, the shallow chatter of the ultra-wealthy, all of it ceased in an instant. Big Shaq walked back in. But this time, he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 3 men in tailored suits, their expressions unreadable, their presence commanding. These weren't just bodyguards, and they certainly weren't trainers. They were business associates. The kind of men who, Troy felt his stomach drop. Lauren, the receptionist, visibly paled, her manicured fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. She had spent years working here, dealing with high-profile clients, CEOs, even celebrities. But this was different. And then, as if the situation wasn't already collapsing around them, another figure stormed in. Graham Sinclair, the owner of Elite Apex Fitness. A man who prided himself on remaining untouchable, existing above the petty politics of his staff. Yet here he was, his face flushed red, his breath slightly uneven, his tailored suit wrinkled from a drive that had been anything but calm. Everyone in the gym stared, eyes wide, breaths held. The same members who had mocked Shaq earlier were now stiff, uncomfortable. No one dared to speak. Shaq didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His focus remained locked on Troy, whose once polished confidence had withered into something pitiful. The gym manager stood frozen, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. For the first time since he had taken over this location, he wasn't the one controlling the room. He was being studied, measured, judged. Sinclair didn't waste time. He rounded on Troy, his voice low, dangerous. "Tell me you didn't just turn away one of our most powerful stakeholders." Troy opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His voice had left him. Shaq watched him struggle, flounder, panic. He could have stepped in, could have pressed harder, humiliated him, torn him apart in front of his staff and the members who had laughed at him earlier. But he didn't. Instead, he did something far worse. He let the silence destroy Troy for him. Lauren, still standing at the front desk, let out a shaky breath. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted her posture, trying to shrink, trying to disappear. It wouldn't work. Sinclair finally exhaled, running a hand down his face, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you've just done," he muttered. Shaq's expression didn't change. He stood exactly where they had denied him entry earlier. And then, finally, he spoke. 5 words, low, even, unshaken. "Is this what you allow?" The words landed like a hammer. A question, but not really. A statement. A warning. Sinclair's face twisted with shame. He turned to Shaq, hands raised, his tone almost pleading. "Mr. Shaq, this was an unacceptable mistake, one that does not reflect our values. I personally assure you, this will never happen again." Shaq's expression remained unreadable. Sinclair turned back to Troy, his voice clipped, final. "You're done." Troy snapped his head up, panicked. "Sir," "I said you're done." Troy's mouth fell open, his hands curled into tight, useless fists at his sides, but there was no coming back from this. Lauren made a strangled sound, taking a half step back. Sinclair turned his glare onto her next. "Pack your things, now." Her eyes welled up instantly. "Please." "Did you hesitate when you refused Mr. Shaq?" Sinclair asked, his voice slicing through her excuse. Lauren's face crumpled. No answer. Because she knew the truth. Sinclair exhaled sharply. "Then don't hesitate now." Lauren let out a shaky breath and turned toward her desk, hands trembling as she began gathering her things. Troy looked lost, frozen in place. Shaq finally moved. He took a single step forward. Not threatening, not rushed, just enough to make Troy shrink back instinctively. And then he looked past him. His eyes landed on Dylan, the young trainer who had watched, who had known, who had hesitated but not participated. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "How long have you been here?" Dylan stiffened under the sudden attention. 4 years, sir." Shaq nodded once, considering. Then he turned back to Sinclair. "Give him the position." Sinclair blinked. "Excuse me?" "Troy's job," Shaq said simply. "Give it to Dylan." Dylan's eyes widened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing shallow. Sinclair hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Done." A ripple of shock moved through the gym floor. Troy looked like he was going to be sick. "Dylan?" Dylan stood taller than he ever had before. Shaq exhaled, then finally, glanced toward the gym members still standing around, pretending not to be watching. Their gazes darted away, shame creeping in. Shaq didn't smile, didn't smirk, didn't offer them the satisfaction of knowing if they had learned their lesson or not. Instead, he simply turned, walking toward the doors once more. But this time, every eye in that gym followed him for a very different reason. The room still hummed with the aftershock of what had just happened. Troy was gone. Lauren was gone. The people who had ruled over elite Apex Fitness with arrogance and exclusion had been removed in a matter of minutes. And yet, the weight of Big Shaq's presence still lingered, commanding the space in a way that had nothing to do with physicality and everything to do with power. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any weight in the gym. He stood near the front desk, his posture relaxed yet unshakable, his hands resting casually at his sides. His face betrayed nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no gloating. He was simply a man who had walked into a situation built to exclude him and flipped the entire script without breaking a sweat. The gym members, the trainers, even the remaining staff, they all saw it now. This wasn't just a rich man who had been denied entry. This wasn't about membership tiers or gym policies. This was about who really had the power. And it wasn't them. Sinclair, the owner, still looked rattled, his forehead damp with sweat as he adjusted his tie. He had scrambled to correct the mistake, firing Troy and Lauren on the spot, but even he knew it wasn't enough. That much was clear when he turned to Shaq with a nervous, expectant look, as if waiting for a verdict. Shaq let the moment stretch. He took a slow, measured breath, then exhaled as he finally spoke. "This gym is about to change." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. The tension in the room sharpened. Every trainer, every elite member pretending not to watch, every remaining staff member stood a little straighter. Shaq turned his gaze to Sinclair. "If I'm keeping my investment in this place, we do things differently now. No more gatekeeping. No more catering to egos instead of results. I don't care how much money someone has. If they walk in here, they deserve respect, or they walk right back out with their money." Sinclair nodded quickly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. Shaq, whatever you say." Shaq wasn't done. His gaze shifted toward Dylan. The young trainer froze. He had spent years working in the background of this gym, doing his job well but never being seen, never being valued. But now he was center stage. Shaq studied him for a second before turning back to Sinclair. "He runs the floor now." The owner's eyebrows lifted. "Dylan?" "Dylan." Shaq's voice left no room for argument. "He's the new gym manager, effective immediately." A wave of stunned silence rippled through the gym. Dylan's breath hitched. His hands curled into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Sir, I don't even—" Shaq cut him off. "You saw what happened today. You knew it was wrong. You stood there, and you thought about speaking up. That hesitation?" Shaq tilted his head slightly. "That's the kind of man I trust to lead. Someone who knows the difference between right and wrong, even if they don't always act fast enough. You'll learn. But you won't learn from the people who ran this place like a country club." Dylan's jaw tightened. The weight of responsibility settled onto his shoulders, but so did something else. Pride. He lifted his chin slightly, exhaling through his nose before nodding. "I won't let you down." Shaq's lips twitched slightly, the closest thing to a smile he had given all day. see that you don't. A few trainers exchanged glances, some looking genuinely impressed, others just trying to process what they had just witnessed. The gym members, the same ones who had mocked him earlier, were now seeing him in a very different light. A mix of awe and regret. Victoria Lane, the socialite who had smirked at his supposed embarrassment, was no longer amused. Her usual air of bored superiority had been stripped away, leaving behind something far more uncomfortable. Uncertainty. She had misjudged him. They all had. Shaq didn't bask in their realization. He didn't gloat, didn't make a scene, didn't waste time teaching them a lesson they should have already known. Instead, he simply turned and walked toward the exit. But this time, when he left the building, no one dared to look away. Big Shaq had walked into Elite Apex Fitness expecting nothing more than a workout. Instead, he had been denied, humiliated, dismissed. They had tried to reduce him to an outsider, a man who didn't belong in their world of exclusivity and privilege. But now, he owned the room. The air inside the gym was different. The same people who had laughed at him, whispered behind his back, and watched him walk out like he was nothing, were now standing silent, uneasy. Their posture was different, no longer relaxed and arrogant, but stiff, uncertain. Their faces held none of the amusement they once had. Instead, there was something new. Respect. And maybe, just maybe, regret. Shaq stood near the entrance, his broad shoulders squared, his presence still looming over the space like a shadow that wouldn't fade. He took one last slow glance around. Not because he needed their approval, but because he wanted them to feel it, to feel the shift. To understand that the power structure they had upheld for so long, one where people like him were kept out, pushed to the sidelines, treated like they weren't worthy, was crumbling right in front of them. Victoria Lane, the socialite who had mocked him from the lounge, stood near the juice bar, her matcha latte long forgotten in her manicured grip. She wasn't smirking anymore. Her lips were pressed together, her eyes cast downward. She had seen powerful men before, but never one who had flipped an entire system on its head without ever raising his voice. Dylan, the newly promoted gym manager, stood tall near the front desk. He still looked like he was processing what had just happened, but there was something different about him now. The self-doubt was gone. His shoulders weren't hunched. He wasn't looking at the ground anymore. The trainers, some of whom had smirked alongside Troy earlier, exchanged glances, their expressions mixed with uncertainty and quiet understanding. They all knew. They all saw. This wasn't just about a membership dispute. This was about something much bigger. Shaq exhaled, slow and controlled, before turning toward the exit. The moment he moved, so did they. Not physically, not obviously, but the shift was there. The way heads subtly turned. The way the conversation paused. The way people who had been so sure of themselves a moment ago were now unsure of everything. Shaq pushed the glass doors open and stepped outside, his black Range Rover gleaming under the city lights. His driver stood at attention, pulling open the door, waiting for him to climb in. But Shaq paused. Not for long, just long enough. Long enough for the people inside to wonder if he would say something. If he would leave them with one final blow. If he would remind them, one last time, that they had been wrong. He didn't disappoint. With one last glance over his shoulder, Shaq smirked. The kind of smirk that wasn't loud, that wasn't cocky, but one that said everything. And then, with a voice low, measured, effortless, he said, "You'll do better next time." The words landed like a hammer. No anger, no threats, just a fact, a truth, a certainty. Because he wasn't asking them. He was telling them. Without another word, Shaq stepped into his car. The door shut with a soft but firm click. The engine purred, the deep growl of power waiting to be unleashed. And as the black Range Rover pulled away, the people inside Elite Apex Fitness remained where they were, standing in their perfect, polished gym, forever changed. The screen fades to black. They denied him. They laughed at him. But by the time they realized who he really was, it was too late. Big Shaq didn't just get even. He took over. This wasn't just a lesson. It was a warning.